Good evening. Tonight I invite you to join me on a journey through time. No ticket, no suitcase required. All you need to do is close your eyes, relax, and let your mind wander back to the Middle Ages, a place where dinner was never a set menu but instead a suspenseful survival game as thrilling as any movie. Have you ever found yourself opening the fridge at the end of the week only to see a single lonely egg, rolling around a few slices of bread, as hard as bricks, a carton of milk that refuses to yield even half a glass, and some wrinkled old apples lying in wait for their fate, then letting out a desperate sigh? There's nothing to eat. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But here's the thing, if you landed back in the Middle Ages with that same stash, you'd be the village's richest person. You'd have all the ingredients to create the legendary immortal stew that would make your whole neighbourhood jealous. Pottage, the magic soup that could turn every little leftover into a hearty, happy meal. Back then, no one had ever heard of a supermarket. There was no such thing as a delivery app. All you had were your own two hands, a patch of muddy land, and the iron will of people who never expected a single day of discounts. They survived on whatever they could grow themselves or gather from every corner of nature. It sounds romantic, but in reality it was a never-ending grind of picking, collecting, and never wasting a thing. And yet it was those make-do with what you have meals that got our ancestors through plagues, famine storms, and endless harsh winters, all thanks to the legendary pottage pot, a soup that never truly ran dry, where every bit of wilted veggie, stale crust of bread, or bruised apple could become a delicacy. Have you ever had a house guest who just wouldn't leave? Pottage is like the charming version of that guest, except in this case, the host actually wants it to stay as long as possible. Picture a thick, glossy brown soup simmering on the stove day after day, week after week, a treasure chest that never empties. Every time someone got hungry, they'd lift the lid and discover something magical. Barley oats, or rye, whatever cheap grains were on hand. Old turnips rolling around, dried onions, cabbage that was wilted yet still fragrant, and on the luckiest days maybe even a touch of golden carrot, or a handful of plump beans. Each family would tend their pottage pot like a prize collection, finish one thing, toss in another, never worrying if the taste would run out, because the best flavour was always the taste of time itself. During the bitterest winter, the pot's contents would get thinner and thinner, until all that was left was ancestral gruel, a bit of grain, and a few knobby root vegetables. No matter who you were, noble or peasant, pottage was always on the dinner table. But here's a little secret. If you were a noble, your soup would be sprinkled with imported spices, wafting with the aroma of wine and studded with bits of tender meat. But if you were a peasant, you'd get to savour the special fragrance of homegrown garlic, wild parsley, and whatever random herbs the wind happened to blow through your window. On special occasions, or if someone managed to hunt down a wild boar, a peasant family would proudly add a chunk of salted pork fat or a bit of smoked bacon to their pottage, not enough to turn it into a meat dish, but just enough for everyone to imagine they were feasting like royalty. Have you ever craved the feeling of sitting by the fire, sipping a spoonful of hot soup, swapping stories, breathing in the smoky scent of earth and ash? That's the dopamine of fairy tales, the serotonin of imagination. And trust me, it's the kind of thing you'll always remember about a bottomless soup pot. People used to dream of being an uninvited guest, just once dropping by someone's medieval home, sitting by a bubbling pot of pottage, dipping a slice of bread as dense as a brick into the soup and listening to laughter ring through a tiny kitchen. That's more than just a meal. That's the experience of sharing, the kind that makes you, even in your dreams, wish you could try it just once, so that when you wake up you realise your own grocery bill is actually pretty reasonable. And you know, if you ever ask someone what's cooking in that pottage pot, the only honest answer would be, whatever we've got. Whatever grain was cheapest and easiest to find, barley, oats, rye, just toss it all in and boil it down until you get a thick golden porridge, fragrant with earth and wood smoke. If you had turnips in, they'd go. If you had onions, toss those in too. If you happened to have cabbage, you'd throw in the whole head. On the rare day luck was on your side and you found a handful of carrots or beans, it was a silent celebration for the whole family. Some households kept their pottage simmering all week, topping it up as needed like a never-ending automatic buffet, except there was never anything new, only the bittersweet taste of endurance and creativity. Just picture it on a freezing winter night with everything outside sealed in ice. The pottage pot quietly bubbles away on the hearth, its gentle aroma blending roasted root vegetables with a shimmer of pork fat glowing like moonlight, offering a strange sense of comfort even if it's only a single spoonful. And what about the wealthy, back then? They ate pottage too, but theirs was a whole different experience. Their pots were symphonies, wine, pepper, cardamom, a little red meat, and sometimes even a rare bunch of raisins. As for the poor, they had to make do with whatever grew wild around the yard, wild garlic, parsley, sage, and every now and then, if they were really lucky, a little leftover fat from a successful hunt. On special occasions, the whole village might share bits of pork fat or scraps of smoked meat, just enough for the fat to glisten on the surface. Not so they could eat the meat, but so they could at least catch a whiff of what a real feast might smell like. It might sound a little sad, but for people back then, pottage was pure fuel. A grown adult could eat 2 or 3 pints of it a day, literally running on soup to power the entire feudal system. Pottage isn't exactly Instagram-worthy, but it kept millions of people alive through centuries of hardship. And if pottage was the warm soul of every medieval meal, then bread was the unbreakable bond connecting everyone tough, humble and resilient, just like the spirit of the people themselves. You know, bread, it sounds simple, but it's actually one of history's greatest symbols of unity. No matter who you are or where you're from when you sit down at a table, there's always some kind of bread, or at least something called bread, right at the centre. But here's the catch. If you're eating medieval bread, you'd better prepare yourself with a strong set of teeth and a very optimistic attitude. Forget about those fluffy, golden, pillowy, soft loaves you see in bakeries today. Medieval peasant bread was a true test of willpower. Jet black, dense, with a crust as thick as a turtle shell. One bite could make your teeth rattle and your soul shiver, and after you finished, you'd be more wide awake than after any shot of espresso. The main ingredients for these loaves were rye or barley, those super hardy grains that could grow in fields where wheat would simply look and give up. And it didn't stop there. Peasants never got the pick of the best grains. The finest wheat was reserved for the lord's table, and the rest, shriveled, insect-bitten, just barely alive, ended up in the peasants' ovens. And every time you wanted bread, you had to pay a milling fee to the local lord. Sometimes that fee hurt as much as the bread itself. To stretch it out, people got creative. They'd add whatever they could find: chestnuts, ground beans, acorns, and in the hardest years, even tree bark, dried grass or straw. Truly everything bread. Just imagine one fine day someone hands you an entire medieval loaf, 2 pounds, heavy as a brick, hard as a rock, and when you thump it on the table it makes a louder sound than the village drum. To make it edible, you had to cut it up, soak it in pottage or dunk it in beer, softening it barely, but giving it a tang of sourness, smokiness and earthiness in every bite. Strangely, people ate a lot of bread, not out of greed, but because after a day of work that made modern gym workouts look like child's play, their bodies needed cheap calories and something solid to fill them up. Records show that a grown man could eat up to 2 or 3 pounds of bread a day. No exaggeration, that alone was enough weightlifting for the whole year. And if you think bread gets softer as it ages, think again. It was only baked once a week at the village oven. The longer it sat, the harder it became. By the weekend it was mouldy and you'd have to soak it in pottage or beer just to chew it. Eating medieval bread was like a masterclass in tough teeth, strong stomach. And believe me, it's also a perfect reminder to appreciate the soft, fluffy loaves you have every morning. But wait, that's not even the scariest part. The real danger came from the seemingly harmless bread itself. Rye is highly susceptible to ergot fungus, which modern science calls nature's own LSD. There were villages where everyone after eating bread would suddenly see fairies' dragons start singing and dancing, or come down with St. Anthony's fire, never realizing that the culprit was the rock-hard loaf they'd just devoured. And yet, despite all the risks and hardships, bread was treasured like a sacred gift. Stealing bread was harshly punished, and wasting even a crumb was considered an offence against heaven and earth. Every meal began and ended with bread, to the point where in times of desperate hunger, people had to redefine bread in every creative way. Straw bread, mouldy, bread, bark bread, as long as it filled the belly that was happiness. Reading all this, maybe you're suddenly craving a taste of medieval bread just to know what life was really like back then, to experience what it's like to eat and build mental toughness like your European ancestors. And who knows, afterwards you might find yourself appreciating your soft, puffy, golden morning bread more than ever before. But wait, if you were lucky enough to have something to spread on your bread, it was always something incredibly simple. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just enough to take the edge off after a long rainy day in the fields. And you know, if your bread was already hard as a rock and the pottage pot was scraped clean, don't lose hope. Just yet, medieval cuisine always had a backup plan for a rumbling stomach. Welcome to the kingdom of gruel, where even a single stray grain could turn into a treasure. If you think gruel was just a side dish, I hate to break it to you in the Middle Ages, it was the true hunger hero. Gruel was the only thing that sat between boiling water and a real meal, barely more than plain water, just a subtle watery turn toward blandness. The recipe, perfect for math lovers and anyone craving a challenge. Take whatever tiny bit of grain you could scrape from the bottom of the jar, add water until your conscience starts to sink in despair, then boil until you look in the pot and think, well, I guess this will have to do. Maybe you remember that famous line from literature, "Please sir, may I have some more?" But for medieval peasants, an extra ladle of gruel was a dream even rarer than winning the lottery. Gruel was the true symphony of survival, just a pinch of grain stretched out for 10 people, where the quickest hands got more and the slowest were left licking the spoon. If you had a pinch of salt to sprinkle on top, you were already living large. The result? A runny, watery, tasteless mash, something you ate just to survive, not because anyone would ever eat it for pleasure. The only thing that separated gruel from hot water was that it kept you full, maybe 30 minutes longer. But don't think gruel was only for the poorest of the poor. Even medieval monks considered themselves gourmets during Lent. Some monasteries held gruel feasts twice a day, sometimes with a bit of honey or dried fruit, a treat so luxurious that the village poor could only dream about it. If you were weak, toothless, or frail, you'd be privileged to eat gruel until you recovered, or as people joked, until you switched over to living on light alone. Old medical texts advised fever, give them gruel. Bad teeth, gruel. If you could afford it, maybe a splash of wine, but for most peasants that just meant more water. Medieval kids, as soon as they were weaned, were moved straight to gruel. No fancy baby food, no nutrient-rich porridges, nothing of the sort. Generations grew up with the memory that gruel is thinner than tears, and plenty didn't make it thanks to malnutrition. And how did gruel taste? If you've ever eaten something so bland that even the dog walks away, you get the idea. Still, don't you feel just a little curious, just a little tempted to try a spoonful of ancient gruel, just to know what it's like to eat for the sake of filling your belly and dreaming about a better meal? Well then, congratulations, you've just joined the indomitable eating spirit of the medieval world. And if that spirit alone isn't enough to fill you up, don't worry, the medieval folks always had one last secret weapon for the hardest days. Turnips, the most underappreciated root in the modern world, but once the saviour of an entire era. It sounds strange, right? These days turnips just sit forgotten on the supermarket shelf, nobody even glances at them. But in those times, turnips were the national lifesaver, sustaining hundreds of generations. All it took was a single seed, no fancy soil, barely any care, and before you knew it, there'd be a pile of big, solid roots. A single turnip plant could yield up to 15 pounds of emergency food. Turnip stew back then was the original fast food, just toss it in a pot. Add water, boil until soft, and if you had salt, sprinkle a little on top, done. It saved time and energy, required almost no effort, and could be eaten year-round without anyone getting bored. Well, except that if you ate enough of it, people said you'd start turning the same colour as a turnip. The best part, it was nearly indestructible in storage. Turnips were packed into cool cellars, and some families even dug their own turnip vaults, lining them with straw, so the roots would stay fresh until the end of spring, no mould, no spoilage. Records from 1286 describe entire villages surviving for 7 months on nothing but turnips stored in straw-lined pits, and not a bit went to waste from the root to the leaves, even the flowers, every part was used. A family of 4 only needed to grow about 200 pounds of turnips to survive an entire freezing winter, with turnip making an appearance at almost every meal. Of course, turnips had their dark side. Writers back then joked that eating too many turnips would turn your skin yellow, just like the vegetable. And as for the smell, try reheating it a few times and your whole house would smell so strongly of turnip that the neighbours would keep their windows shut tight. As practical as they were, turnips never really counted as celebration food. There's even an old joke, ask a poor farmer, if you won the lottery, what would you eat? And he'd answer, deadpan turnips, but don't forget to add some meat. And of course, turnips were never alone on those medieval dinner tables. Their 2 most loyal sidekicks were cabbage and onions, a holy trinity that not only kept hunger at bay, but also had the power to brainwash everyone's sense of smell. You might be surprised, but cabbage was the undisputed king of the vegetable patch, easy to grow fast and mature with a single head, sometimes weighing up to 15 pounds. Plant just 10 cabbages and you could feed your whole family for months. Here's the magic, just keep picking the outer leaves and the core keeps growing like some sort of self-renewing, no-charging needed food. Fresh cabbage could be stored in a cellar for months, but if you wanted it to last all winter, you'd ferment it into sauerkraut. No more worries about mold or spoilage. Some gigantic sauerkraut cellars from the 14th century still show traces of hundreds of cabbages, a fermented feast for generations. Onions were cabbage's natural-born best friend. They'd grow anywhere, store for ages, repel bugs to keep the garden healthy, and add a punch of flavour to every humble dish on the peasant table. In some places, cabbage and onions were even accepted as taxes. Just bring your veggies to market and pay in produce, instead of cash proof of their national treasure status. Anytime cabbage and onion went in the pot together, if you managed to add a scrap of pork, it was a family banquet. Even without the meat, the rich aroma alone could chase away any uninvited guests lingering near your door. There was a flip side, though. Eating too much cabbage and onion meant, let's just say, there were musical after effects. Village records actually describe collective awkward moments after dinner, and some monasteries even banned cabbage on visitor days just to protect the community's reputation. Oddly, the doctors serving the nobility back then used to warn eating too much peasant food like this would make aristocrats lethargic, gloomy, and slow-witted. But in reality, poor folks who ate cabbage and onion all year stayed healthy, while the rich feasting on delicacies often suffered mysterious little ailments. Still, everyone knew living on nothing but veggies just wasn't enough, especially for people who worked their bodies to the bone every day. That's where the silent heroes came in: beans and peas, tiny protein bombs that kept the poor strong all winter when meat had vanished from the kitchen. Did you know a single small plot of beans could yield up to 60 pounds of dried beans, enough to feed a whole family through the toughest of times? Growing beans and peas was easy too. They'd even give nitrogen back to the soil, so no matter how poor the land, toss in some seeds and come harvest, you'd have fresh homegrown protein. The classic method: soak dried beans overnight, boil them until soft, mash them into a thick, hearty paste. Sprinkle a bit of salt if you had it. Maybe add wild herbs from the field for a real gourmet upgrade. Don't dismiss it as baby food. That bean mash was the energy source that let peasants survive 12-hour days of hard labour, day after day, with zero complaints. How does that sound? Just picturing a meal of turnip, cabbage, onion and mashed beans humble, sometimes a little fragrant, makes you smile and honestly kind of crave a bite just to see what true survival tastes like. During the hardest stretches of history, when dinner was a real-life survival challenge, mashed beans became the main course sitting on the table, like a noble's feast, while bread, pottage, or even gruel were only distant dreams. Some records say that in the famine year of 1315, whole English villages survived for weeks on nothing but mashed beans and small beer, while bread became a legend to tell the grandkids. And it wasn't just the peasants. Even monks in monasteries across Europe relied on beans. Church law banned meat for hundreds of days each year, sometimes half the year, making beans a true protein blessing for every monastic kitchen. Picture this: a monastery of just 40 people would stockpile over 3,000 pounds of dried beans every year, enough for every morning and evening meal, enough fuel for monks to meditate in the fields from dawn till dusk. And dried beans, practically immortal, store them in clay jars or wooden barrels and they'd last for years. Archaeologists have found beans 10 years old that were still technically edible, though the taste was something you'd never forget. For all their magic, beans had one fatal flaw: those musical consequences. It's no accident that medieval medical books warned avoid eating too many beans before church or going to court. There are even old jokes about peasants who snacked on too many beans at market. Nobody wanted to get too close to them. All in all, beans and peas kept the poor healthy enough to keep ploughing. But let's be honest, no matter how nutritious, eating the same thing day after day gets boring fast. That's why medieval peasants always dreamed of something new, a chance to change it up to taste anything different, even just once. And sometimes that golden opportunity came from the most unexpected places. You might ask, where did meat come from when the rich had already eaten all the best cuts? The answer: eat whatever you can get your hands on. Medieval people were true masters of zero waste. Sure, the nobles enjoyed roast venison and juicy spit-roasted chicken, but what about the poor? They were left with only the extra parts of the animal organs: feet, heads, ears, skin, fat, and yes, even the brains. Take the pig's head, for example. After a slaughter, a peasant family might receive the head as their share. You'd slice off the cheeks for a little tender meat, fry the ears until they crackled, save the snout and lips to make jellied terrines for later, and as for the brain, beat it with onions, and you had a pretty decent breakfast. The bigger the animal, the more hidden treasures you got. A cow's stomach would be cleaned boiled till soft, stuffed with grains, liver and heart a rustic version of haggis. A sheep's lungs sliced and sautéed with onions made a quick meal after slaughter day, and the animal's blood, that never went to waste mixed with grains stuffed into intestines, then boiled or fried into blood sausage. Its flavour is the stuff of childhood memories. If you couldn't get premium meat, don't worry. Small wild game ended up on the table too, squirrels, hedgehogs, even rats in truly desperate times. In the harshest winters there are records of entire villages trapping martens, foxes and all sorts of creatures no one would normally touch so long as it kept you alive another day. There was an unwritten rule in the countryside: if it doesn't kill you, it's food. This kind of creativity stretched every rare meat day into a feast for the whole extended family. One cow's organs could feed several households, while the best cuts, well, those were just enough for the landowner's family to polish off in a single evening. Organs and offal were so valuable that stealing them was punished as harshly as stealing premium cuts. In some places, swiping a sheep's heart, liver or lungs could land you a fine worth 2 weeks' wages. That's how precious those forgotten parts were. Of course, offal had to be processed fast and no refrigerators. You either smoked it, salted it, or ate it right away. Many of these dishes were reserved for slaughter day, served piping hot fresh from the animal. In a little festival against the winter cold, everyone gathered around a steaming pot telling loud jokes to forget the hunger. And if you really listened, you'd realise those hearty laughs sometimes held a salty note of tears, the sweetness of hope, and that unmistakable offal flavour you'd never forget from the hardest times. But you know, not everyone survived on just turnips, mashed beans or pig organs. The lucky ones living near the sea or rivers had a source of protein that could swim herring. Medieval folks didn't have a McDonald's drive-through, but they did have their own fast food legend, salted herring, super convenient, just salty enough to make you thirsty for a week, and it'd last the whole winter without spoiling. Why was salted herring the king of the peasant table? First, herring swam in massive schools, easy for anyone to catch. Second, thick layers of salt turned them rock hard, letting you transport them all the way from the coast to the remotest village. Third, no need to worry about meatless feast days. Meat might be forbidden, but fish was fair game all year round. Picture the high season in Great Yarmouth, England. A single fishing fleet could haul in over 40 million herring in just a few weeks, enough to give every villager 7 fish apiece. The process was, well, fragrant freshly caught herring were gutted, packed thick with salt, stacked in wooden barrels right on the boat, and left for the sea breeze to finish the job. The smell was so powerful that seaside towns had to build special processing zones downwind. If you lived nearby, you knew what your signature cologne would be year-round. For peasants, salted herring was a lifesaver. No fridge needed, no cooking required, just tear it open and eat fast and simple. It was especially handy on meatless fast days, which made up more than half the year. On those days, herring became the superhero of protein. The cheapest herring was just plain salted, called white herring. If you had a little more to spend, you'd buy red herring, smoked delicious and less likely to get mouldy. Medieval people ate so much herring that it showed up in the tax books. Tiny Scania Island was sending out over 300 million herring a year. Monks in York ate it so regularly that each one averaged more than a herring a day. So much so that herring breath basically became a personal trademark. No matter how you prepared it, minced as a relish, mixed into pies, soaked to cut the salt, nothing could ever banish the herring breath after effect. And after such a salty meal, what did people drink to wash it down? Don't expect crystal clear water. Wells were dug next to latrines. Rivers carried all the upstream villages' leftovers, so drinking water was sometimes riskier than going without. But Providence never leaves anyone without hope. Medieval folks invented small beer, part thirst, quench a part medical miracle. Brewing beer involved boiling the water, killing off germs. A little alcohol kept it from spoiling, so those who stuck to beer stayed healthy, while the water drinkers took their chances with the hospital. This beer was just 1 to 3% alcohol, not enough to get you drunk, but perfect for everyone in the family, even the kids, to drink morning, noon and night, without losing their grip on the plough. A grown adult could easily drink nearly a gallon a day. During harvest season, up to 1.5 gallons. So if you read in old chronicles about constant breaks, it was probably for another beer and another trip to the bushes. Not just laziness. Brewing was a woman's craft. They'd brew once or twice a week. Store it in wooden barrels and drink it all before it went bad, no refrigeration required. Leftover grain from the beer would become bread, and leftover bread would become starter. For the next batch of beer, nothing went to waste. Sometimes beer was even used as payment bell ringers or rat catchers, or anyone working hard could take their wages in beer, sipping as they worked. Life was easy and carefree, with bellies always sloshing with liquid. So just thinking about a meal of salted herring, dense black bread, and a gulp of small beer in an old European village, it's enough to make you almost taste the salt, smell the tang, and hear the laughter rising on a cool breeze from those distant, unforgettable days. But what about special occasions? Even the poorest peasants knew how to celebrate and go all out once in a while. On holidays, weddings, or whenever an important guest visited, they would bring out their prized drinks: apple cider, honey mead, simple bottles of happiness, a far cry from today's flashy cocktails. Sounds extravagant, but apple cider was actually a clever preservation strategy, a rare, sweet solution to thirst. In apple-rich regions like England, France, or Spain, nearly every farm had a few scraggly old apple trees standing guard around the yard. Come harvest, everyone would gather to crush the apples, let the juice ferment naturally into light cider, and stash it away in cool cellars. That gentle sweetness could last half a year, never spoiling. Stronger spirits were reserved for big events, weddings, festivals, where every sip carried laughter, the scent of wood smoke, and a little buzz of simple happiness. Mead honey wine was rarer than gold. Only the boldest families dared keep their own bees. You'd spread sweet honey on your bread, save a little to brew fragrant mead for winter, and still have enough left for healing coughs, tending wounds, smoothing hair, or just claiming the best homemaker in town award. Some villages valued beehives as highly as land, writing them into marriage contracts, and wills passing them down for generations. Really, honey was the true star of the medieval kitchen galaxy. Back then, sugar was as rare and precious as diamonds, something only the nobility ever tasted used as medicine or in sweet cakes at grand feasts. As for the poor, they had to rely on honey and wild berries. And honey wasn't easy to get. To claim that liquid gold, you had to chase after wild bees, smoke them out, endure the sting, and trade a few welts for a pot of sweet golden treasure, worth more than any candy bar today. Wild berries, strawberries, raspberries, bilberries grew along the forest's edge, or by the fields, summer's secret for anyone nimble and quick enough to gather them. Preserving berries was nearly impossible without sugar, so they were truly gifts of the season, here today, gone tomorrow. On feast days at big parties, dessert was usually a simple cake mixed with honey and wild berries, the pinnacle of luxury reserved for the lucky few invited to the table. It sounds so simple, but just a spoonful of honey and a handful of wild berries could make any medieval child drift off to sleep with a smile. There's an old joke that when a peasant was asked, "If you could be king for a day, what would you do?" he answered without missing a beat, "Eat berries and honey until I couldn't breathe. A sweet dream for sure, but maybe only in your sleep." But what if one day the honey was gone, the last berry picked, what then? Don't worry. Medieval folks had already teamed up with the squirrels, the true hoarders of the forest. Just watch a squirrel nibble a chestnut and you'll think, that little guy must know survival secrets even the rich haven't figured out. That's right. Chestnuts, the silent saviours sometimes called the bread trees of poor villages in France, Italy and Spain. One big chestnut tree could drop nearly 200 pounds of nuts each fall, enough to keep a whole family alive through the freezing winter, when fields slept and the grain bin was bare. In bad crop years, villagers collected chestnuts so obsessively that tax records had to include each family's trees as part of their assets. Chestnuts are naturally sweet, delicious roasted in ashes or over a fire tender and easy to digest when boiled. To keep them longer, you could dry them and grind them into flour for chestnut bread, not as fluffy as wheat bread, but plenty filling and comforting through a snowstorm. Acorns were the next level challenge, bitter and loaded with tannins, needing endless soaking and rinsing to tame their bite. But once you conquered the bitterness, acorn flour could save entire villages from starvation, though after eating it, you'd understand why only desperate times called for such desperate measures. Records from the Great Famine of 1315-1317 tell of villagers fighting over a handful of nuts in the woods, sometimes even brawling for the right to gather chestnuts and acorns, the forest gold, whose value is hard to imagine today. The wise always kept a stockpile chestnuts and acorns buried in dry sand, kept for a whole year, so at any time you could open a jar and find a survival treasure in the heart of hunger. But the forest offered more than just nuts. Every season was an adventure. Spring brought wild greens, dandelion, nettle, sorrel, gathered with gloves and boiled for a vitamin-packed meal, a fresh burst of green after months of nothing but brown grain. Nettles, famous for their sting, turned out to be a nutritional wonder when handled properly and boiled. Summer meant wild mushrooms popping up everywhere, but only the sharp-eyed dared pick them one mistake, and your whole family could be travelling forever. Safer were wild onions, garlic goosefoot lamb's quarters, tossed into the pottage, transforming a simple meal with a whiff of forest flavour. Full was the season of a vitamin C explosion. Ground cherries, wild apples, crab apples, rose hips too sour or astringent to eat raw, but perfect for drying as medicine, or for a change of taste in the next dish. And the true soul of every foraging trip, the women with forest-keen eyes, the queens of gathering whose names made it into the village records. They knew which mushrooms were safe, which plants were useful where and when to find every green treasure. In hard times, they'd lead whole groups out to hunt forest vitamins, sometimes earning handsome rewards for their skill. See, even just the stories of chestnuts, acorns and wild greens are a treasure trove, where survival and creativity blended into one. Just imagine one day you're out gathering a basket of forest nuts, boiling up nettles, for soup, roasting chestnuts over a wood fire. Is there any dream sweeter than that? When you know that out there in the deep woods, everything around you can become a humble little feast, if you're willing to try and bold enough to dream. Now imagine when even the forest's last treasures ran out, when picking up a handful of nuts turned into a desperate scramble. Survival became the art of turning anything and everything around the house into dinner. Wild food in the Middle Ages, forest, greens, roots, berries, bark, even wild plant roots weren't just fun little extras. Studies of old diets show that in a normal year, wild plants made up about 5 to 10% of a peasant's total nutrition. In lean years, that could shoot up to 30%, and there were villages that survived for weeks on nothing but foraged greens and tree bark. Laws of the time even recognized this struggle. Forests and wastelands had foraging rights, allowing the poor to collect wild food on land that wasn't theirs. Legal battles and feuds over who could pick what were constant simply because it was a matter of survival. No one could afford to give up their right to gather. And then when even wild food grew scarce, human creativity took over in a last-ditch fight to stay alive. Some medieval peasants invented a kind of bread that would make any modern stomach shudder. Ash bread, the ultimate lifeline. A primitive loaf that needed no kitchen, no fancy ingredients, just sheer will to live. The method was charming in its simplicity. Use any flour you had left, mix it with water until you got a sticky dough, shape it flat and bake it directly in hot ashes from the fire. No oven, no baking stone, no pots or pans, just fire ash and the determination to survive. Ash bread never showed up on a happy day. It was the food of a last resort, only named when not a soul in the village could scrape together a real loaf. Yet during the famines that swept across Europe, these drab, grey little breads saved countless lives. The miracle of ash bread was its flexibility. No more wheat or barley. Use whatever flour was left, rye, oats, millet, beans. When even those were gone, people ground up acorns, dried tree bark, wild roots, even pulverized dry grass. During the darkest years, like the Great Famine of 1315 and 1317, there are records of peasants baking bread from nothing but sweepings from the granary floor, a flour that was really just a dusty mix of dirt and leftover grain fragments. This wasn't a new trick either. On normal days, many households baked flatbread on hot stones, but ash bread was the final step. When there were no stones left, you went straight into the coals. Ancient cookbooks even warned brush off the ash before eating, though your teeth will still crunch on grit from the bread. Surprisingly, ash bread cooked in a flash. Forget hours of kneading and rising, just a few minutes in the hot embers, and it was ready. This was a lifesaver for people too hungry or weak to spend time fussing with the kitchen. In fact, old work songs sometimes mention ash bread as the field food quickly made during a break, everyone grabbing a piece to ward off hunger. And the taste. Exactly what you'd expect, burnt bitter, and sometimes with a definite hint of real ash. There was an old joke back then: ash bread only tastes better if it falls in the mud first, since at least the mud covers up the taste of the ash. No matter how ugly or gritty, ash bread delivered life-saving calories. During the worst European famine, up to 15% of the population died of hunger or related diseases, but most survivors owed their lives to meals so unappetizing they seemed impossible to swallow. A 16th century farming manual left behind a blood and bone lesson. When the seeds have failed, and bread cannot be made the usual way, a wise farmer remembers to bake bread in the ashes, for it is what saved our ancestors from the very beginning. But then there were times when even ash bread wasn't possible when every scrap was gone. That's when the medieval art of improvisation truly came to the rescue. The greatest dish back then wasn't anything fancy, but rather whatever you've got. Anything left lying around the house got tossed into a pot boiled and called dinner. Medieval peasants were true masters of fridge-clearing cuisine centuries before anyone invented the phrase. For them, this wasn't just about avoiding waste, it was a way of life. The Lord's ledger might list every ingredient in detail, but a peasant's menu was simple. Eat whatever you've got, waste nothing as long as it's enough to give you strength for the fields tomorrow. Curious what a classic whatever's left meal looked like. Spring, a handful of wild greens, leftover turnips, maybe a few dried beans. Summer, any garden veggies you could find, plus a scrap of leftover smoked fat for flavour. Full forest mushrooms, chestnuts, all fried up with cabbage. Winter. Whatever stores were left tough and tasteless, but you ate it anyway. The cooking method changed with the day. If you had a fire burning all day, toss everything into a pot and make soup. If you were out working, bury the pot in hot ashes and let it bubble away till evening. No time to cook, just chop up leftovers with stale bread and call it a meal. This way of eating grew out of simple reality. Medieval people usually ate just 1 or 2 big meals a day. During harvest season, they'd have a light meal in the morning and only gather for a real feast in the evening, perfect for the throw everything in cook once for everyone style. Many regional specialties across Europe today actually started from this whatever's left approach. Ribollita in Italy, leftover greens and stale bread simmered together. Ratatouille in France, garden vegetables, whatever needed, using up at the end of summer. All those hearty stews and rustic casseroles, most began as poor folks' inventions, pure improvisation. Even tax records from the Middle Ages reveal the true mixed plate peasants paid taxes in the oddest combinations. 3 turnips, half a cabbage, a handful of dried beans. That was the reality of their daily menu. On holidays, a whatever's left meal could be upgraded. Maybe there was a pinch of salt, a rare bit of spice bought from a travelling merchant, or a few new vegetables from the early harvest. These tiny luxuries were enough to turn an ordinary peasant meal into a grand banquet in the eyes of those who worked for it. See, it was in the hardest times that the dishes nobody wanted became lifesavers, leaving us a legacy of resilience, resourcefulness, and a kind of humour that learned to laugh at hardship. You know the French have an old saying, the best sauce is hunger, and those medieval peasants with their sunburned hands and empty bellies were the true culinary masters of that idea. When you've lived on watery gruel, gnawed on bread as hard as stone and smelled salted herring all winter, you learn if you're hungry enough, anything can taste delicious. But above all, it was out of these tough times that they created a unique kind of kitchen magic where everything could become a meal, as long as you were willing to try and refuse to give up. It wasn't about luxury ingredients, but about whatever the garden gave, whatever the woods provided, whatever was in season, using every last scrap, so that in truth our modern farm-to-table trend is just a fancy echo of those hard old days. Just imagine tonight, by the soft glow of a lamp you let your shoulders relax, unclench your hands, listen to your own even breath and let your mind drift back to those ancient kitchens where the fire crackled low, the pottage bubbled gently, chestnuts roasted in the embers, black bread was tough but fragrant and laughter floated up, even in the hardest times. Maybe deep down every one of us, no matter the age, still hungers for a meal as simple as the first meals of humankind to eat, to live, to tell stories, and when night falls, all you really need is a hot bowl of soup and a peaceful dream to satisfy every hunger, even the hunger of the soul. So just picture this tonight in your dreams. You're a poor medieval child sitting by the soup pot, dreaming of a feast with soft, sweet bread. And when you wake up, maybe you'll feel a new gratitude for everything you already have. May you sleep deeply and dream of a medieval feast where even the best sauce is simply a hungry belly and a heart full of gratitude for life's simplest things. Good night, fellow traveller through time.